Enga mana, enga reo, enga rau rangatira, o ngā hoe whā, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko rauto tōku maunga, ko teima tōku awa, ko komo tōku whenua tipuna, ko Bryony aho. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. These professorial lectures are a tradition unique to universities, and they follow a certain form and tradition, and usually build to a sentimental crescendo where you thank your loved ones for their support over the years. I'm going to have to flip that around and thank my loved ones first, because if I do it the other way around, I will reduce myself to tears, lose all credibility, and my makeup will run. So I would like to first thank my parents. They can't be here tonight because they are off pursuing their mission to single-handedly resurrect the New Zealand tourism sector. And also I'd like to thank my partner, Helen, who also can't be here tonight because, as she put it, I can listen to you talk anytime. But my thanks for their support is no less heartfelt for that, and without them, I obviously couldn't do what I do. It was pretty well fated that I was going to be an engineer. Everybody here probably went through that exercise at primary school where you had to describe what you were going to be when you grew up. Some people might say I'm still waiting to grow up, but back then I did my duty. Now in the class, everybody else wanted to be either a farmer or a farmer's wife. This was a small rural community in the 1970s. I, on the other hand, wanted to be a shop steward, which horrified my parents, but what I actually meant was Captain Peacock in Are You Being Served? But I also wanted to, in my spare time, make crazy contraptions. I wanted to invent a big wheel, a sick bag, and an umbrella, and the complete lack of punctuation in that sentence makes it unclear whether this was a single invention or three separate ones. Suggesting also that I was destined to end up in universities, which are great shelters for those of us of a more innovative bent. I started my journey in Cornwall, and of course Cornwall's great contribution to the world is the Cornish pasty. Now that begs the question, why did I ever end up in food research? Because if there's one item of food that can in no way be improved upon, it is the Cornish pasty. From Cornwall I moved up to Peterborough to work for a company called APV Baker, and then from there went to the University of Bath to pursue a degree in mechanical engineering. And much as I pursued it, it got away from me. I only lasted 3 weeks in mechanical engineering, realizing it wasn't for me after all. But after a few drinks in the bar, I discovered a different discipline, materials science and engineering. And once I changed my degree, I absolutely fell in love with the topic and didn't want to stop. At the end of my undergraduate degree, I wanted to continue studying materials science and engineering, and so I wrote to every single English-speaking university in the whole world, excluding America, and said I would like to come and do a PhD. And every last one of them wrote back and said, certainly come. Our overseas fees are, insert eye-watering figure here. Apart from this chap, Barry Welch from the University of Auckland, who wrote back and said, oh yes, there's this problem with overseas fees, but we'll find a way around that. I'm going to be in London next week. Do you want to meet for coffee? And as it turns out, Barry's entire recruiting strategy for his research group was anybody who was daft enough to ride a motorbike from Bath to London in the middle of winter for a half-hour coffee in McDonald's. So a few months later, I started my PhD at the University of Auckland, and as with any PhD, it was completely straightforward, no ups and downs whatsoever. And after the requisite amount of time, I got the most important part of a PhD, which is the floppy hat. Now, the thing about PhDs is that they fit you with a world of skills, not just in what you researched. And so you're faced at graduation with a whole bunch of different options where you could go next. Now, of course, my options have finally led me here to the University of Waikato and the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research role, which as a job is more fun than a barrel of monkeys. There's no two ways about it. But the thing about a DVCR's role is that it is all about other people's research. And for tonight and tonight only, I'm going to be utterly self-indulgent and just talk about my research. My PhD was in aluminium smelting, and at the conclusion of that PhD, I was offered a job at the Bell Bay smelter in Tasmania. Luckily, I was also offered a job running the Research Centre for Surface and Materials Science at the University of Auckland, which seemed at the time like a lot more fun. Not least because it came with a role as lecturer in the Department of Chemical and Materials Engineering. And much as I won't speak about it tonight, teaching what I worked out over the years is about 15,000 engineers has possibly been the highlight of my career. It also meant I had to develop my own research career, and I went from aluminium smelting into surface engineering, thermal spray coatings. The role of Research Centre on Surface and Material Science meant I got to collaborate with a really wide number of people. This is a picture of a hard-to-remove catheter, which is probably as uncomfortable as it sounds, collaborating with people from the med school. I collaborated with geologists and did a bit of mineralogy, a lot of natural fibre research. This is possum fur. I worked on wood fibre composites with the Forest Research Institute, now known as SCION. And flakes of paint, so many flakes of paint. Paint from old Mazdas, paint from old Masters. I looked at every bit of sort of paint. What this really illustrates is, admittedly, I was casting around somewhat. I was trying to find my research niche, and I was having a bit of difficulty. So one evening, late, I was eating my apple, sitting at my desk, working away, and somebody that day had left the scanning electron microscope set up for what's called cryo-SEM, or low-temperature SEM, which is what you use for looking at hydrated specimens in the microscope. So, what do? You've got an apple, you've got $1 million microscope, it's obvious. So I popped some of my apple into the microscope to have a look at what it was, and this is what an apple looks like at massive magnification, which I thought was kind of cool, but didn't really think anything more of it, until a few days later, this wonderful woman, Bronwyn Smith, who's sadly no longer with us, but she was a senior lecturer in food science at the University of Auckland, and she started to describe to me what all the bits of this apple were. And she talked about the cell walls and the polysaccharides gluing the cells together, and as she spoke, the structure and how the material behaved began to come clear in my mind. So as a little experiment, imagine, if you would, taking a ripe apple, the very pinnacle of ripeness, and as you bite into it, your teeth deform the apple cells, the parenchyma cells. They're basically just little juice-filled balloons that are all glued together. And the glue is quite strong in a ripe apple. So what happens is this. Your teeth deform the cells until finally they rupture. So what you experience is the noise of the rupture and that explosion of juice. You're going to interpret this apple as crisp and juicy. Now, if you left that apple alone for 3 or 4 weeks, or started with another apple, and bit into that one, well, as apples go past the point of perfect ripeness, that glue between the cells starts to break down. So what happens is this. The cells, when you bite down on them, instead come apart in your mouth. So instead of experiencing this apple as crisp and juicy, it tastes dry and floury, even though it might have exactly the same amount of juice in it. Now, once Bronwyn was done explaining all of this to me, the die was cast. I was no longer a materials engineer. I was a food materials engineer. Now, any engineering colleagues in the room know fine well that the holy trinity of materials engineering is the relationship between processing, which changes structure, which changes properties. Now, in the traditional materials science, that structure might be something like the grain size of a metal. In food materials science and engineering, that might be something like air cells in an apple or ice crystals in ice cream. The processing routes in food engineering might be natural routes, like ripening, or they might be cooking or freezing. And the properties, instead of the strength and toughness of traditional materials engineering, well, we still care about strength and toughness, actually, but we interpret them differently as things like food texture and taste and aroma and functionality. And I think it's fair to say over the years I've messed around on every point of that triangle, but for this evening, I'm just going to speak about this one, texture or mouthfeel, how the food feels in your mouth. Now, the challenge of studying texture is incredibly important as a food property, but it's one we generally don't think about very much. So again, I'm going to ask you to indulge in a little experiment and ask yourselves, I won't ask for a show of hands, that's just embarrassing, ask yourselves which of these 2 corn chips is going to taste better? This one? Or this one? Okay. Like I say, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. Inevitably, everyone's going to say the corn chip on the left will taste better. But actually, both those corn chips are going to taste exactly the same. The question that you've actually answered to yourself is a question relating to how they're going to feel to food texture. And as the mother of food texture, Maria Seźniak, said back in the early 70s, texture's taken for granted. We generally only notice it when it's wrong. Now, this illustrates an interesting point about research. We're never completely alone. We always build our research on the research that has come before us. And for me, looking at food oral processing, or chewing, as we more normally know it, one of the most important founders of this science was this chap. Oh, here we go again. This chap, Horace Fletcher. Now, Horace Fletcher was an American, and in the late 1800s, I stretch to call him a nutritionist, but only because calling him an eccentric quack would be slightly rude. He had a theory that you should chew every mouthful of food 100 times. For a long and healthful life, chew every mouthful of food, including liquids, 100 times. He, in fact, coined the term, nature will castigate those who don't masticate. And he ended up with the nickname, the Great Masticator, which I am deeply jealous of. He also died a millionaire, which just goes to show, really, doesn't it? But the funny thing is, old Horace was onto something. Sounds a bit silly now, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, I could not have picked a better time to stumble into food materials engineering, because at that time, this chap, Marco Morgenstern of Plant and Food Research, which was then Crop and Food Research, was getting together a crew to chase some money to look at how food structure influenced food texture. And we were fortunate enough to land a fairly large program that supported a multidisciplinary cross-university team for 5 years as we created what was called the Food Structure Platform. And we looked at all sorts of foods and had a lot of people chew them up. This is a set of biscuits. My PhD students in this period spent a lot of time asking people to chew food and spit it out. And I told them I didn't want to see the results, but they shared them with me, so I'm sharing them with you. And of course, the challenging thing about studying how you chew food is that ideally it happens in a closed mouth. We don't really want to see it. So you have to use a bunch of techniques to figure out what's going on. And one of the techniques we used was a technique called temporal dominance of sensation, or TDS. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about TDS, but in a nutshell, you get a panel of people and you give them some food, and they take a bite of the food, and as they chew it, they select from a list of textures, in this case, which texture is dominating their attention at any given time. So with those biscuits, they might select crunchy. And then as they carry on, it might become bitty or crumbly and finally soft and sticky. And so it gives you the temporal change in how texture evolves. Now, the reason I didn't label any of these lines is because what you do is you take all of the data and you lump them together and you get this consensus. And every TDS plot you ever see looks just like this. What it tells you is that at the start of chewing, at the start of oral processing, everybody's agreeing. In this case, if this was the biscuits, that blue line might be a texture like crunchy. Everybody's agreeing. The biscuits are crunchy. At the end of oral processing, again, everybody's agreeing. They're saying maybe that green line is soft or sticky. Everybody's agreeing, saying it's soft and sticky. But in between times, you've got all this sort of chaotic stuff happening. And this got me thinking about the complexity of texture and how we perceive that issue of texture. And that was useful because what I really wanted to answer, one question was, how does texture influence satiation and satiety? Now, just to get our terminology quite clear here, satiation is that whole selection of signals that tells you that you're full, so it brings a meal to a close. Satiety is the period that you go before you're hungry again. So satiation, you're full. Satiety is how long you're full for. Now, a lot of people have looked at the impact of texture on satiation. And without fail, they've found that there is some impact, but this is how it often works. Excuse me. Say they're looking at yogurt. You take a thin yogurt and a thick, creamy yogurt. The thick, creamy yogurt makes people feel fuller sooner. But the thick, creamy yogurt also takes longer to travel through the oral cavity. Your oral processing time is longer. And without fail, when you look at all the studies on satiation, they've found that the longer you take to chew something, the sooner you'll feel full. So this brings us back to old Horace. He was onto something because the longer you chew something for, the sooner you'll feel full. Turns out my great Auntie Ouida was also onto the same thing. She always ticked me off for eating too fast. So what I wanted to answer, though, instead of chewing time, is there just an impact of texture? Does it have an impact on satiation, irrespective of how long you're going to chew something for? Now, when we were exploring this question, I was very lucky at the time to have an excellent postdoc called Dane Larson and a very good PhD student called Jingyang Tang. And they developed these model foods based on a gelatin agar gel. They were little bite-sized pieces. And they put all these inclusions into them, like ground up poppy seeds for a gritty sensation or sunflower seeds for a hard sensation. And we created these models that were low complexity or high complexity. And the important thing, because these were little bite-sized pieces, they all took about the same length of time to chew. There was no significant difference in the chewing behavior between the low complexity and the high complexity. So then we ran some satiation trials. Now, these little things, they weren't terrible, but they weren't nice enough to eat a whole meal of, even for undergraduates. So what we did was something called a preload trial, and we recruited a lot of people, and we gave them a little starter of 3 of these little pieces. And then we fed them a meal, an ad libitum meal, eat as much as you like meal. The first course was pasta and tomato sauce, and the instruction was to eat as much as you possibly can. Infinite refills, keep eating, and signal when you cannot eat another bite. And then we offered them chocolate cake, and without fail, everybody ate another bite. Several bites in some cases. And then we weighed how much people had eaten. And what we saw was that anybody who had had the high complexity starter went on to eat less of the meal than anyone with the low complexity starter. That happened across 2 different panels with 2 different sets of model food. We were pretty excited about this, not least because when we questioned people throughout the whole process, they never felt any different. So this was totally unconscious. That begged the question, why? And everybody, any researchers here know that when you've got a question, why, where do you go? You go to the Marsden Fund. So we went to the Marsden Fund, and I was lucky to grab a couple of chums to take along with me. Michael Houtis, who's a psychologist, he specializes in something called psychophysics, and Nicholas Gant, who's a sports scientist, but he focuses on something on neuroimaging. And the question we wanted to answer was which bit of this whole complex of hormones and neurological signals in your mind, which part of that were we influencing? Were we just confusing your brain? Were we just doing a Horace and saying, this is so horrible to chew, I'm going to stop now? We didn't know. We still don't know. We haven't finished. Sorry about that. I'll leave you hanging on that one. You'll have to come back for my next inaugural lecture. Part of the problem is we're still trying to answer the question, what do we mean by food texture? What do we mean by food textural complexity? Now, Michael's doing a great job in beginning to tease this apart from a psychological perspective, but part of the problem is I'm sure you already have an idea in your head what I mean when I say that, because it's a little bit like Justice Potter Stewart said. He coined the immortal phrase, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Now, of course, he was talking about pornography, but the same thing applies to food textural complexity. So I thought, well, let's start with the simpler food and go from there. So I decided to look at chocolate, because why not? And I was foolish enough to say to some of my friends at the Nestlé Research Centre in Switzerland that I was going to quantify the oral processing of chocolate. And they giggled in a slightly embarrassed fashion and changed the subject. I began to realize why after a while, but still I thought it was a bit pessimistic of them. And as an engineer, I wouldn't be allowed to give a presentation without having an equation in here. And so I have described the oral processing of chocolate in a single mathematical model. And for the first time in public, here it is. So as it turns out, chocolate isn't particularly simple at all. Here's what it looks like. This is a confocal laser scanning microscope image of dark chocolate. So for my materials engineering colleagues in the audience, chocolate is a multi-scale, metastable, polymorphic semi-solid. It's not simple. Anybody else, just look at the picture. It's cool, eh? The yellow stuff here is the fat phase. That's the cocoa butter. The black is the particulate phase. That's the sugar. And the blue, that's the other particulate phase. That's the cocoa nibs. And this is just dark chocolate. This is Whittaker's Ghana, if you're interested. So imagine taking this and putting it in your mouth and beginning to oral process it. What happens? Well, for a start, you start adding body heat. So the fat phase begins to melt. Then you start to add some saliva. So you create what's called an emulsion. And the first emulsion that you create is a continuous fat phase with droplets of saliva in it. But then as your tongue continues to mix it and you continue to add saliva, you end up going through what's called phase inversion. And the whole thing flips around. and you end up with a continuous phase of saliva with droplets of fat in it. Now that influences, all of those structural changes influence how you perceive the texture of the chocolate and how you perceive the flavor of the chocolate. But things get more complicated, because whenever you're thinking about texture perception or flavor perception, it occurs at the intersection of the product and the person. We're pretty good at making food products. We've been doing it for a very long time. We're getting pretty good now at understanding the microstructure of those food products. This, again, is a spat-out mouthful of chocolate. And then we take these incredibly carefully manufactured structures and we give them to people. And the way you perceive texture will change as your age changes. The way you perceive texture will change depending on where you come from. And there's an emerging body of theory that suggests that we each have our own innate oral processing strategy. We each tend to chew things or tend to suck things, and people refer to this as mouth behavior. So this sounded like a fun area to explore. So one of my PhD students who's just finished and gone back to China, actually, Yilin Li, he recruited 300 people. Fairly easy to do when you're going to feed them chocolate. And he gave them chocolate, and he watched how they ate it. And what he found was that you could mostly group people into people who sucked their chocolate, people who chewed their chocolate, and the slightly awkward ones in between, which we won't talk about tonight. And the suckers and the chewers got to about the same sort of structure of that chewed-up mouthful of chocolate, which we talked about before. They all got to the same endpoint, a continuous saliva phase with droplets of fat in it. But the route they took to get there changed on whether they were sucking or chewing. They went through a whole bunch of different intermediate structures. We threw a bit of flavoring into the chocolate. We chucked in a tastant. We added some menthol. We invented mint chocolate. Yay, go us. And we looked at the impact of the chewing behavior on how our participants experienced the flavor. And the chewers get this really fast and really high hit of menthol that goes away just as quickly and it's all over. The suckers take a lot longer to get to where they're going. They don't reach the highest of highs, but they perceive that menthol for a lot longer. This could easily be a comment on people's personality, but it is a comment on their chewing behavior. Now, I'll put my DVCR hat back on briefly. As DVCR, when I get out and speak to our researchers here at Waikato, which is one of the great perks of my job, to be honest, I love hearing from people how they want their research to change the world. And everybody does. It's why you go into research. But some people know that that change is going to happen immediately, and some people know that change is going to happen in the far distant future. But that's what research is about. It's about changing the world. So what does this research do to change the world? Well, the near future thing is fairly apparent from this. If you wanted to deliver, say, a functional ingredient, say omega-3 fish oil, and you wanted to use chocolate to deliver it, well, would people taste the fishiness? We can begin to answer that question by understanding how people chew their chocolate. But what's the longer goal for this sort of research? Well, I'll finish up with this idea. Can we design different foods for different consumers? Yes. Why would we want to? Well, if we come back to some of our older consumers, as you age, there's good things about aging, but some of the less good things is things like your bite force decreases, your salivary flow rate changes, sometimes it's difficult to swallow. And one of the things that many of our most elderly consumers experience is a lack of pleasure in their food. If you go to any rest home, mealtimes are almost deathly silent because people are concentrating really hard on safe swallowing and chewing things. There's no fun in that. My dad, who can't be here tonight, he loves a crisp, crunchy apple. He can no more bite into a crisp, crunchy apple than he can be here tonight. So what can we do to understand that and give people back that pleasure in eating? So one of my PhD students who's just finishing up at the moment, she recruited a whole ton of people, and she divided them by age, and she gave them these model foods, their gelatin gels, soft, medium, hard, measured their bite force, and asked them, what's too hard for you? And again, we're still teasing apart what this means, but imagine where this might lead. Could we design foods that for most of us would be a bit ho-hum, but for some of our older consumers would give them back crunchy, chewy textures that they've had to step away from. So I'm going to stop there with two more things that are absolutely vital to do as a researcher. Now, I'm blessed that my research discipline, engineering, research is a team sport, and I wouldn't have been able to achieve any of this without my PhD students. So this is some of them here. This is some of the people who produced the work you saw tonight, and I'm endlessly grateful, and it is a huge privilege to supervise them. Equally, it would be most remiss of me not to acknowledge the people who funded this research over the years, both external funders and the universities that have supported me. So with that, it just remains to say thank you very much for your attention. Ngā mihi nui, kia koutou, pō Māori e.